Okay. Hi, Dr. Lesk. How are you?
Good, how are you?
Good. Thank you for coming on the show. It's nice to have you here. So, we're going to be talking about your book today. Your book is called Footprints of Schizophrenia. Have you published other books, or is this your first one? Or
This is my first one, but I finished a second one that I'm working on getting published.
is it on the same topic?
Related, but it's called Entropy's Desire. It's about the second law of thermodynamics and how that affects illness, mental and physical and other things.
Okay. Why did you decide to write a book?
What I want patients to do, and I'm talking about psychiatric patients, major depression, bipolar, schizophrenia, anxiety disorders, is to go to their psychiatrist and say, what is the connection between evolution and mental illness?
Between evolution and mental illness. So, you're suggesting that it's a genetic disorder rather than an environmental one?
I'm suggesting it's not genetic, it's due solely to the evolutionary moment that we're in currently, which means that 50,000 years ago, there was no mental illness. Maybe 20,000 years from now, there will be no mental illness. It's purely due to the evolutionary moment that we're in.
Okay, that would be more or less the opposite of what I just said.
Right. Genetics plays a minor role.
Can you give me an example? What's going on right now that's causing mental illness?
50,000 years ago, we got language. But humans have been around for millions of years, and language revolutionized how we use our minds. By 10,000 BC, we'd wiped out all the other species of Homo. And this revolution in how we use our minds is so new that not everyone's on board. And those who are least on board are the ones we call mentally ill.
One of the things that I've talked about on this show quite a bit is that technology, generally speaking, has advanced much quicker than I think man has been able to digest it, particularly in the last 20 years or so with the advent of social media and everybody carrying around a phone. I think it is creating even more mental depression and illness amongst people. Would you agree?
Well, there's a strong push to blame a lot of things on social media, and it probably plays a role, but I think it's oversimplification. There are a lot of causes of depression. Suicide rates are going up. People are kind of withdrawing from evolution. So I think it's more complicated than just social media.
Okay, well, you mentioned language as the starting point.
Yes.
What would have been the next major event or something that happened that pushed the mental illness further up with people?
Well, language caused us to suppress a neurochemical called dopamine, and every single mental illness that we have is due to the desuppression of dopamine. So what happens is that people learn language, they learn to suppress dopamine, schizophrenics do that, but then around 18 to 25, it all falls apart, and this dopamine suppression desuppresses. And there's a surge of dopamine, and it's not surprising that every chemical that we use to treat mental illness either blocks dopamine directly or suppresses it indirectly.
Okay, can you define schizophrenia for people that are not doctors or scientists?
Schizophrenia is a chronic mental illness. It's often marked by what we call psychosis, which means hallucinations, delusional thinking, bizarre behavior. Usually starts between the ages of 18 and 25, and it doesn't go away. It's a lifetime diagnosis, and it requires medication treatment.
People with schizophrenia or people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia can it can manifest itself in different forms. Some people can be violent, is that correct?
Yes, but on a whole, schizophrenics are quite passive. They're not violent murderers.
Okay. What basically is their inability to do? If they're not violent, are they just unable to function in society or
Well, what happens is that with the onset of language, which revolutionized our minds, our thinking became much more realistic. When schizophrenics regress, their thinking becomes more primitive and childlike, basically what it was 50,000 years ago. They still have to confront the modern world with this primitive way of thinking. Children think differently than adults, and schizophrenics go back to a more primitive thinking style once the dopamine desuppresses.
Okay, I see a formula here. I'm just going to read it, and maybe you can explain it. It says protoplasm plus mutation times time equals human. What does that mean?
DNA started evolution because DNA is imperfect and causes mutations. It's the mutations that cause evolution to advance. Without mutations, there'd be no evolution. So once we have protoplasm with DNA, which is living matter, and we have mutations, given enough time, evolution will progress to something like a human, which has the greatest capacity mentally of any animal. In fact, the brain is probably the most intense organ in the universe in terms of complexity.
What about the psychotropic drugs that have been prescribed over the last 40, 50 years? Are they helping at all?
They help a lot, but psychiatry remains in the dark ages. We don't have a single blood test, CAT scan, x-ray to make a diagnosis. We rely totally on what the patients tell us. And this is because organized psychiatry refuses to look at the role of evolution in mental illness. So our medications are very flawed. They help, they definitely help, and it's better to be on them than not. But the side effects are daunting. They take too long to work. We don't know which medicine will help which person. We could do a lot better. We help a lot of people, but we could do a lot better.
Okay, so tell me about your book, Footprints of Schizophrenia. How is this going to help people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia?
My hope is that if enough patients go to their psychiatrist or therapist and demand to know the role of evolution in mental illness, things will start to change. And orthodox psychiatry will perhaps be a little more open to new ideas and issues that it's been missing. And once that happens, our research focus will change. Hopefully, we'll come up with better chemicals, medications that don't take forever to work, that have fewer side effects, that are more on track with the individual needs. We need to refocus our research goals because we've left something entirely out, and that is evolution.
Okay, well, how does knowing that evolution plays a role in this going to help your ability to help the patient? I mean, you can tell them that, but what good does that do?
That doesn't do good. What does good is when psychiatry stops trying to focus on the wrong thing. We've been off base and misdirected in our research for years, and it's because we refuse to look at the role that evolution plays. Everything is in a context. You can't understand biology of something unless you understand its evolution, where we came from, where we're now, and where we're headed over the next 20, 50,000 years. And psychiatry simply refuses to look at it. Once it does, our whole research focus and protocols will change for the better, and we'll start to create better treatments, better medications, things that will help more people quicker and with fewer side effects. So there's a lot of hopefulness in this if psychiatry can start to change and look at different points of view.
Was that your target audience when writing this book, the psychiatric community versus patients?
Target audience is the lay public, including patients, caregivers, families of patients. I want the public at large to see that there's something missing from a psychiatric playbook which needs to be expanded. So I want the average person to read this book, understand the role of evolution in their mental illness. It's not just schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is the big kahuna of mental illnesses, but this applies to major depression, bipolar, anxiety disorders, OCD, the whole panoply of mental illness is encompassed in this paradigm. And if people look at it, I think they will see that it's making a tremendous amount of sense. You know, I review articles for a large CME company, and I hate to keep reading articles where they're trying to stick a square peg into a round hole. And it's because something is missing. And, you know, orthodox psychiatry has no interest in this. I've written dozens of letters, tried to publish many articles. I've published a few, but the overall interest is crickets. And that needs to change. Once it changes, I think our effectiveness will change and our medications will be much more focused and better.
How did you discover this connection to evolution?
Well, maybe 10 years ago or more, I'm kind of a dyed-in-the-wool nerd. And I said to myself, you know, these explanations that we give patients, like connectivity, chemical imbalance, genetics, they're very superficial. And someone has got to come up with something deeper. Who better than myself? So I started broadening my learning base. I read several texts of anthropology. I read about Darwinian evolution. I read about language theory, developmental psychology, even the second law of thermodynamics, and came up with something that I think is much more satisfying, much more relevant, much more all-encompassing than the catchphrases that most patients hear from their doctors.
You mentioned something about schizophrenia being impossible to diagnose other than from what the patients tell you. Is there a particular trigger or something that they say that you kind of go, oh, well, there must be schizophrenia? Or is there some kind of a pattern that you look for?
Well, first of all, my point is that there is no blood test, X-ray, or CAT scan that can diagnose it. But the diagnosis usually becomes pretty clear around the age of 18 or so, late high school, early college. We see schizophrenics kind of withdrawing from their friends. Their functioning declines. They may start saying odd things. You know, like I had a patient tell me that he could only eat peanut butter because the rest of the food chain was poisoned. They may think they're being followed. They may start to hear voices, say very paranoid things. And it usually becomes pretty obvious after a while that we're dealing with schizophrenia.
Do you think we need to bring back the mental institutions that many were closed during the 1980s? Do you think they were helpful?
Well, what happened was around 1955, a medication called Thorazine was developed. It was not developed to treat schizophrenia. It was designed to be a calming medication. And someone said, well, let's give this to agitated schizophrenics. Lo and behold, it reduced their symptoms. And by 10 years later, 100,000 patients had been discharged from what they used to call asylums, which is a good thing. And we figured out that the reason Thorazine works is that it blocks dopamine. So we don't need to go back to asylums. We need to get better medications, better treatments that will get even more people out of psychiatric institutions and help them on a much higher level. And I'm hopeful that we can do that.
Do you think some of the homeless crisis is related to these people having nowhere to go?
Well, definitely, but a certain percentage of homeless are schizophrenic. A lot of them are drug addicted. And so we have to kind of differentiate one or the other, and some schizophrenics are both. So schizophrenia does definitely contribute to the problem of homelessness. And schizophrenics, in a sense, want to drop out of society because they can't cope with the complexities of the modern world. Their thinking process is not as complex, it's more primitive, and they find it easier to just drop out. So that's part of the homeless problem, which I think is also very complex. I don't know if anyone has an absolute answer to it.
We are just about out of time, and you said you had a second book in the works. Is it going to be on schizophrenia? Is it part 2, or is it something different?
Well, it's called Entropy's Desire. It's about the second law of thermodynamics, entropy, and how that plays a role in both mental and physical illness and social behaviors like wars, suicides, societal chaos, it's a core issue, like evolution, that's being under examined. So I'm trying in both of these books to bring out issues that are under-recognized, but yet crucial.
Footprints of Schizophrenia has been released.
Yes.
Okay.
Amazon, BarnesandNoble.com.
All right. Last question. Do you have a website that you want to give out?
StephenLeskMD.com. You see a lot of information there about my ideas. I have some YouTube videos you can take a look at, but it's there. Please read the book and ask your therapist or psychiatrist about evolution and why they're not focusing on that enough.
Well, Dr. Lesk, thank you for coming on the show. This was very informative, and best of luck with your book. Hope it does well.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.